Navy Matters.
Hello, my name is Liam Carballal, and welcome to History Repeats on hmTv, where we discuss historical events that have helped shape our world. Joining me today is Holocaust historian Richard Quinlan, and we will be discussing one of the more bizarre stories from the Holocaust, the story of Rafael Trujillo, the Parsley Massacre, and the Sosa settlement. Richard, have you heard of this guy, Rafael Trujillo, before we mentioned him?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I had only heard about him in a very sort of ancillary way, not all that much. So I know in talking with you a little bit, this is a very complex figure who touches on a lot of different areas of history. Yeah. So I'm really intrigued by what you have to share.
Rafael Leonidas Trujillo took the presidency of the Dominican Republic on August 16th, 1930. And like many rulers from that era, he was inspired by the fascist and Nazi movements gaining popularity in Europe. Aside from being highly repressive and dictatorial, Rafael also adopted Nazi views on race science, which would manifest in a large-scale massacre of the nation's Haitian population, but also in a strange roundabout way, the rescue of hundreds of lives during the Holocaust. Now, I think a good place to start would just be a brief history of the Dominican Republic up to that point. So the Dominican Republic was first discovered, Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, was first discovered by Christopher Columbus, 1492. And it did not start out great. The native Taino people first encountered Columbus were immediately beset upon and became victims of horrific violence and enslavement. When he arrived on the island, there were about 400,000 Taino people. Within about 70 years, they were all gone. They had all died of disease and violence and enslavement and harsh treatment. From there, the Dominican Republic, San Domingo at this point, became something of a pirate haven. The port of San Domingo was actually burned to the ground in the 1580s by pirates. The Spanish never really got a good hold on the island, and so there were cattle rustlers throughout most of the hinterland, especially in the north coast. At the same time that they were dealing with pirates, they were dealing with the French. In the 1660s...
That's a lot to wrestle with at one time.
Yes.
I mean, pirates and the French, but yeah, go ahead.
The French wound up conquering the western part of the island, which would eventually become Haiti. And it also was not great, as this was the time that sugar became a very valuable commodity in Europe. And so the French brought in thousands upon thousands of African slaves, half of whom would die within the first year. From there, the two halves of the island split linguistically, politically, and also very much ethnically. The western half became very Africanized. There was Catholicism, sure, but there was also a lot of traditional voodoo and hoodoo cultural themes running through the part of the island at that time. The eastern half, San Domingo, it was more Catholic. It would become literally the Dominican Republic. So that's where that name comes from. Starting in 1792, the eastern half was actually conquered by the new French Republic. The French Revolution had just occurred, and they had invaded Spain. It was a part of the Napoleonic Wars. They conquered the territory, and then Haiti rebelled against the French. They wound up taking control of San Domingo, and it would just seesaw back and forth between the French Empire, Haiti, and the Spanish Empire, and also various rebel groups among the Dominicans who wanted their own nation. And that would last until about 1865. But that was not the end of it. 4 years after San Domingo gained independence, became the Dominican Republic, Ulysses S. Grant tried to annex the entire island and turn it into a refugee for American slaves who had just recently gained their freedom. U.S. intervention in the territory did not stop there, though. Throughout the early 20th century, the U.S. would invade San Domingo numerous times, mostly to make sure that they were paying their debts to foreign lenders. Teddy Roosevelt was part of that, the Great White Fleet.
So is this part of the Roosevelt corollary and
Yes.
walk softly, carry a big stick kind of foreign policy idea?
Precisely, yeah. It was about showing American greatness and that America, reinforcing the Monroe Doctrine. America belongs to the Americans. No more Europeans. We will police this area. Bit imperialistic on our part, but what are you going to do? It was during the 1916 intervention, the third intervention, where our protagonist, not hero, he is not a great person, he enters the story. Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. He was born in 1891 to a half Haitian mother and a cattle rustler father. And that is an overarching theme throughout Dominican history. Is outside of San Domingo, the main city, there was not a lot of great control. The U.S., dealing with that, they created a National Guard force to help them control the island. And in 1919, Rafael joined this police force. Prior to that, he had been a pimp, a gang member, and also a bodyguard for the various sugar plantations on the island. He was a problem recruit. He would use his position to extort money from locals. He would coerce sexual favors from women. But this didn't matter because his loyalty kind of superseded his loyalty to the government, to the U.S. occupying force superseded any sort of problematic behavior. In 1924, by the time the U.S. forces had withdrawn from the island, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel. I think you wanted to ask something?
Well, I was just going to say, it's just a fascinating story so far. I mean, you're talking about someone with a pretty dark past here.
Yes.
And so really the U.S. was willing to overlook a lot of, shall we say, character flaws.
Yes.
But why exactly? Why was the U.S. so willing to capitulate and say, do whatever you'd like?
I think it's sort of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Like Joseph Stalin, he committed horrific crimes, but politically it was kind of convenient to make an alliance with Stalin because we were fighting Hitler and he was the priority. I think it was sort of a more perverse situation here. The U.S. wanted to gain control of the island, maintain stability, make sure these debt payments were remade. This guy was willing to work with us. He was a terrible person, but the ends justify the means in their eyes if it meant stability on the island and they could get the money that they were owed. The U.S. withdrew in 1924, but that did not lead to stability. The newly elected president, Horatio Vasquez, despite not being especially popular, tried to run again. That was banned by the Constitution, and this led to a rebellion. Trujillo, he initially let the rebellion succeed because he wanted... he let the rebellion succeed initially because he wanted to use this as a vehicle to allow himself to come to power, which he did. The rebels kicked out Vasquez. He took over. He immediately began arresting political opponents, murdering political opponents, intimidating the opposition. So when the election happened in 1930, he won with 90% of the vote. I can't imagine that was a legitimate those were legitimate numbers, but that is what happened. This was during the Great Depression. So right away, Trujillo began looking for scapegoats economically for the nation's plight. He found that in the Haitian population. It should be noted that Trujillo might be the perfect dictator. He had his own secret police. He murdered journalists, political opposition, anyone who criticized him. Women disappeared off the streets. Probably not most egregious, but like almost farcical. He changed the capital, the name San Domingo, to Ciudad Trujillo. So he was full cult of personality at this point. As for the Haitians, he accused them of stealing cattle from local farmers, stealing jobs, driving down wages. Things gradually got worse and worse, and it did not help that the border issue between San Domingo, Dominican Republic, and Haiti were not settled until 1936. Trujillo, he wanted to kick out all the migrants. He was tired of having to even look at them. Let me give you a sense of how racist this guy was. He was accused of putting on facial makeup to make himself look whiter. So it gives you kind of a sense of where he stood.
Now, was he also using, because you're talking about blaming the Haitians and coming up with these excuses, the scapegoating, yep. What sort of propaganda was he using, if any, to try to promote these ideas? I mean, certainly coming out in face paint sends a pretty clear message, but were there posters, songs, parades, anything that he used? Not
that I know of. He did make a lot of speeches. I actually have one.
That'll do it.
Yeah. Here's one. To the Dominicans who are complaining of the depredations by the Haitians living among them, thefts of cattle, provisions, fruits, etc., and were thus prevented from enjoying the peace products of their labor, I have responded, I will fix this, and we will have already begun to remedy the situation. 300 Haitians are now dead in Banica. This remedy will continue. Wow. So, yeah, he controlled the press at this point. So basically anything he said was the law of the land. Anything he said was just facts.
And this wasn't done in secret. I mean, he's actually announcing that Haitians have been murdered. He's promoting murder here.
Absolutely not. This is a deliberate policy of his administration. He made speeches about this constantly. He constantly scapegoated the Haitians. Things really came to a head in the second half of 1937. He passed a law that forced all migrants in the country to register with the government. 8,000 were deported. But as he took tours of the countryside, he still kept seeing Haitians, and that really bothered him. It was around this time in September that he actually met with delegates from the Nazi Germany. He was awarded with an autographed copy of Mein Kampf, so shows you where he's coming from. They were met with rapturous applause by Trujillo's newspapers. The killings started on October 2nd, 1937, and these were extremely brutal. They were not done with rifles or with camps. They were done with pickaxes, machetes, knives, hand weapons. And this was done deliberately by Trujillo soldiers so they could have plausible deniability. If you're killed with a machete, you can blame that on, conceivably a peasant farmer. If you shoot them with a bolt-action rifle, farmers aren't walking around with that in the 1930s, especially in the Dominican Republic. So it was obviously the army. That eventually started happening because the soldiers got tired of killing Haitian migrants with machetes, axes. They moved on to rifles. you also have to understand there's not a lot of difference, especially because this is going on in the hinterlands on the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There's not a lot of difference between native Haitians or native Dominicans and Haitian migrants. Some of these Haitian communities have been there for centuries at this point. So distinctions are not great. They're basically the same community. To give you a sense of how kind of almost arbitrary this is, the name that's often given to this massacre is called the Parsley Massacre. And it's called that because one of the techniques that was allegedly used to differentiate Haitians and Dominicans in these communities, Haitians pronounce the word parsley a little bit differently than Dominicans. They put like an accent on it, and if you were asked, how do you pronounce this? They would hold up a piece of parsley. How do you pronounce this? If you pronounce it wrong, it would often mean you were shot or hacked to death. But this was in a course of a week. That's how long this lasted. Between 12,000 and 30,000 people were killed. And it wasn't just hand weapons either. Many of the people killed were drowned to death. They had their arms and legs bound, and they were thrown into the ocean. And
now, where was the international community at this point concerning this atrocity?
That's an interesting point, because Haiti, initially Haiti's government, they didn't do anything. The reason why, and this I think is kind of interesting, the president at the time of Haiti had a close relationship with Trujillo's government, and he actually tried to prevent the press from speaking about this initially. But to their part, the Dominicans did not do a good job covering this up. News spread quickly. At one point, an American journalist, I have his name here, Quinton Reynolds, actually managed to get into the field hospitals where this was all happening and saw up close the violence that was being committed. He even confronted Trujillo directly to his face, which, wow, about what was going on. Trujillo always denied that the military was involved in this, but eventually he ordered a stop to the killing. This is most likely because he needed U.S. pressure at the time. In January 1938, the Roosevelt administration called delegates from the Dominican Republic and Haiti to hash out some sort of agreement. It was kind of gross. Trujillo took no responsibility for what happened. The reparations payments were minuscule. And even then, what money was offered, I think it was like $500,000 for something like 15,000 victims. And that's a low estimate. So they're getting what? Like $50 for the family who was killed? Even then, most of that money was stolen by corrupt bureaucrats. There were tighter border policies as part of the agreement. It was gross. It was a gross thing. Trujillo became an international pariah for a few months, but in the spring of 1938, an opportunity presented itself in the form of the Avian Conference. And now I would like to turn that over to you because that is more your...
Well, you've opened up a lot. And what is staggering is you think of the connections, the similarities of so much that you discussed between what was happening in the Dominican and what was happening in Nazi Germany. Right? The scapegoating, the blaming Haitians for stealing cattle. And you have Nazi propaganda saying that Jews that were less than 1% of the German population at the time controlled 20% of the wealth. I mean, these kinds of blatant lies that were just repeated so often that it was accepted as truth. And you talk about this conference, and what had happened was, obviously, throughout the 1930s, as the temperature was rising in Nazi Germany and the conditions were worsening, there was increasing pressure for the international community to do something. And so in July, there was a collection of about 32 nations and various kind of peace and what we would kind of look at today as NGOs meeting in Evian, France to discuss the crisis facing Jewish refugees. Not a single nation decided to take even one soul, except for
the Dominican Republic.
That's right. And, what's fascinating is when you look at some of the language that came out of Evian and even the people who represented the countries, for example,
If I just interrupt, I think a few countries even decided they were going to take less refugees after Evian.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There were nations that actually, I think Peru and Argentina tightened their immigration policies. I mean, the U.S., for example, didn't send a leading diplomat, didn't send a Secretary of State. They sent a man by the name of Myron Taylor, who was the former head of U.S. Steel. He was known as the textile czar. He was an extraordinarily wealthy and successful friend of FDR. The majority of the conference, the majority of the discussion was actually about electing a chairman of the conference. If there was one achievement, it was that, which ended up actually being Myron Taylor. But some of the language was really fascinating. The Australian representative was a high-ranking military official by the name of T.W. White. And his lasting quote was, "Australia does not have a race issue and does not wish to import one." So think about how he's discussing Jews. As a race, it's actually mimicking Nazi language. And so, the easy thing, and you and I have talked about this at length, the easy thing to say is, well, the Roosevelt administration turned their back on people in need. But you mentioned it was the Great Depression. And you have a lot of competing voices and a lot of voices coming out of Congress saying, how can we justify taking in people of any age? I mean, there was something known as the Wagner-Rogers Act that would have allowed 20,000 German Jewish children into the United States. That ultimately died. There were arguments coming out of Congress that we can't afford to take anyone into this nation. We don't have jobs, we don't have food, we don't have the basic necessities for our own people. And of course, Roosevelt also had individuals like Breckinridge Long, the Assistant Secretary of State, who was in his ear, and Long was recorded in his diary as describing Mein Kampf, a copy of which Trujillo was given. He described it as eloquent. So, this was a very, very complex period of time. Evian is a failure. It is a political and a humanitarian failure. But why did Trujillo bring in Jewish refugees?
Because he wanted to make his country whiter. That is a quote from him.
Yes. This was not being done out of the kindness of his heart. This was not being done for any kind of humanitarian concern. Exactly. So even when you have individuals whose lives were being saved, it was being done under the guise of what Trujillo wanted to do to change the nature of his country.
Wow. All right, Rich. We are running out of time here, so I think we're going to make this a two-parter.
Oh, thank you. I can come back?
Yeah.
Wow,
sure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Next time, we will be talking about the Sosa colony and how a genocidal white supremacist tried to create a Jewish settlement, a Jewish colony on the North Shore of San Domingo. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of History Repeats Itself on hmTV. Rich, it's good to have you. Thank you for your insights.
Well, thank you, Liam. Appreciate it greatly.
All right. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, take care and be well.